Chapter 11 Planet 11 Scrambled eggs, fried mushrooms, kedgeree, triangular slices of fried bread, bacon, baked beans, sausages, brown sauce. All slid greasily from Charlie's plate as the Rock of Judgement tipped forward into its new and deadly course. He steadied himself. What was that? Eddie hurried over to the navigation console and squinted to make sense of the readings. We're speeding up, going into a close orbit. Charlie put his breakfast tray aside, wiped his yolk-stained lips clean with a napkin, and joined his brother at the console. A screen on top showed a computer projection of the likely outcome of the spiral in which they were locked. Blue animated lines converged in an urgently warbling red point at a range of mountains on the approaching world. Warning messages unrolled. "We're going to crash!" Charlie exclaimed. "Where is she?" "What, Zeus? Who else?" Charlie's hand dipped into his pockets and his fingers slid into the grips of his knuckle duster. "She sprung a game quicker than I'd reckoned on." "No game of mine." The brothers turned as Zeus stalked into computer control. She was accompanied by Pierpoint, who looked convincingly cowed. Eddie leapt forward, but Zeus raised a forbidding hand. "Leave him. He may still be of use." She flung her head back and a small liquid noise of disapproval issued from the back of her throat. "Must I spend my time rounding up prisoners that you allow to escape?" Eddie waved Flark and Gajork forward to watch Pierpoint. The computer room shook once more. "The engines have been interfered with." Zeus pushed Charlie's raised fist aside and strutted over to the navigation console. She consulted the diagnostic system and grunted at their response. "Somebody has sabotaged the control linkage." "But we've got a couple of the lads posted at the engine room." Eddie leaned forward and flicked the security channel of the display screen to the relevant camera. A monochrome picture flashed erratically through belts of static. Charlie's eyes bulged. "Who the hell is that?" There was a man inside the engine room, and some sort of robot with him. "No," Zeus cried. Her silver face whirled to face Charlie. "Your Ogron servants are pathetic. All the normals should have been killed." Charlie's fingers tightened around the grips of the knuckle duster. "What did you just say?" Zeus pushed his arm aside. "Idiot! There's no time for such puerile distractions." The console clicked. The display screen sent up reams of navigational data and suggested emergency routines. Zeus ran her eyes down the list and snarled. "If the linkage is damaged," Pierpoint shouted over, "there's no way to right the asteroid." Eddie whispered in his brother's ear. "Why don't we kill her now?" Deep rumbles issued from Charlie's stomach as the acids of his digestive system reacted to his confused loyalties. "Soon," he croaked. Zeus slammed her hand down on the console. "Useless! The orbit will decay and we will impact with the surface. We have less than an hour." Eddie had a suggestion. "Why don't we just transmat down?" "We couldn't risk it," Charlie replied. "When this rock crashes, it'll smash the planet apart anyway. 11's got a weak crust." A fractured scream burst from Zeus's shining lips. "No! I will not be cheated of my vengeance!" Behind the eye slits of the mask, an orange glow started to build up. "There must be another way. We could travel on in your ship, circle in space, and return to 11 when the damaged area has stabilized." Charlie shook his head. "No point. It'd take us a good hour to load the morning gear back aboard." Beams of hate sizzled from Zeus's eyes and struck the security screen. The glass fractured. The doctor gripped the brass handle of a courtroom door as the corridor on level 9 swayed again. "Somebody needs driving lessons," he said and righted himself. His head banged a concrete pillar. "Definitely a refresher course at the very least." The rock shook up and down, and he was flung up to the ceiling and then jerked back to the floor. "Maniac! The spaceways aren't safe nowadays." The door to Pierpoint's office was ahead. He steadied himself, waited for the shaking to stop, and then ran for it. It was locked. He fiddled in his pockets, whipped out the sonic screwdriver, brought it to the mark, and gained entrance. An instinctive movement, and his nose and mouth were covered with one end of his scarf. The air had been contaminated by thick, yellow vapor. He coughed out the small amount caught in his throat and dabbed the tip of his tongue at the solid residue that stained his teeth. The substance was sharp, with corrosive chemicals. He backed away and was about to leave the office when he saw the fingers of a pale hand through a clearing patch of gas. The hand belonged to Stokes. The doctor propped up the heavy body and searched for a pulse. Fortunately, the fellow had not been exposed for too long. The gas was thickest on the other side of the room. The doctor reasoned it must contain the source. He tightened his grip on the end of the scarf pressed to his mouth and dived into the dense heart of the cloud. The chemicals in the vapor irritated his eyes, and gritted tears stung each time he closed his eyelids. His eardrums popped as he advanced. The sonic screwdriver was still in his hand. He fumbled with the tiny controls on the side and extended the device into the cloud. It bleeped, leading him to the nozzle set in the side of the globe. Thin streams of the vapor poured from the tiny openings. A precisely directed channel of ultra-modulated sonic waves welded the concealed innards of the globe, and the hissing ceased. The doctor staggered back to where he remembered Pierpoint's desk to be, and he searched for the office's environment controls. He thumbed the air conditioning button and slats in the wall clattered open. Emergency vents started to suck the unfamiliar matter from the atmosphere. The arms of one of the big chairs embraced the doctor's aching body. Its back, solid and upright, soothed his spine. He took his hat from his pocket and wafted the gas away from him. "Well done, Doctor," he managed to say. "Yes, very well done, Doctor. How awfully clever and heroic of you." "Well done, Doctor," said a familiar voice from beneath the desk. He peered down. "Romana! What on earth are you doing down there?" She sat up and stretched, her long blonde hair falling immaculately over her shoulders. "Being gassed and looking at your boots." Stokes moaned and raised his head. "Ah, the errant doctor. I've heard so much about you since our last meeting." He climbed slowly to his feet, wiping yellow-stained fingers on his coat. "Now, let me guess. You've dispatched Zeus, the Ogrons, and the Nisbet brothers, and we're safely on our way home?" The doctor gave a broad, toothy grin. "No," he said. "Disappointing, isn't it?" "Pierpoint locked us in here and turned on the gas," Romana said. She examined the inert globe. "Do you think he suspects us of being in league with Zeus?" The doctor swung his feet up on the desk and popped his hat on his head. "I very much doubt it," he said matter-of-factly. "Because, of course, he's in cahoots with her himself." "What?" Stokes spluttered. Romana perched on the desk and said, "What do you mean, of course? You had no more idea of that than anybody else." "Well, no," the doctor admitted, "but I enjoyed saying it anyway. A man has to have his simple pleasures." He pushed the hat from his face and continued, "I think that before we do anything else, we ought to try and work out exactly what's going on here, eh? That safe looks interesting for a start." Romana picked up her cap and started to rearrange her hair. "What safe?" The doctor leapt from the chair and swept a row of books from the shelf. Beneath was a metal hatch protected by a combination lock. "Ah," said Romana. "That safe."
"Imperative we return to TARDIS and vacate,"
K9 said as he and Spigot hurried down the corridors leading away from the engine room.
"Destruction of this environment is now certain."
What's the point?" Spigot stopped. "You know as well as I do that we haven't a hope." K9 swiveled to face him and beeped impatiently.
"Urgent, we must return to TARDIS."
"I never thought it'd end like this, K9, Spigot said wistfully. "Well, we all have to face it, you know. And this is it, K9. The big one. The final curtain." He took out his wallet and flipped it open. Inside was a color photograph of Angie and the kids. "I'll never see them again. Funny, but I always thought I'd die a hero's death. I used to dream about it as a kid. But life's not like that, is it? Don't really know if this qualifies. Yeah, I suppose I'll be taking Zeus and the Nisbet brothers with me. You could call that glory. But what's the cost? Is it worth it, eh? He looked back at the photograph. Hell, I just couldn't say no, could I? Maybe it had to end this way, eh, K9? He looked up, but K9 had gone. In his place was an Ogron. Spigot yelped and jumped. A wide red beam shot the Ogron in the back, and it toppled heavily down. K9 trundled forward.
You will accompany me to the TARDIS,
he said angrily. Thanks, said Spigot. Hey, you're the best partner I never had, K9. The robot dog whizzed off.
Your input is unnecessary,
he said.
Please conserve use of speech sensors for relevant information.
That dirty little planet, sighed Stokes. Grubby blue chemicals whirled in stormy clusters over the surface of the ever-closer Planet 11 as observed through the porthole of Pierpoint's office. One of the last places I'd have chosen to die. Oh, really? Asked Romana as she clipped her hair back into place. Where would you have chosen? He closed his eyes. Oh, perhaps one of the pleasure centers outside this rotten system. Nothing like that here, of course. I've always found the people of these planets rather provincial in outlook. Tatty suburban tastes. They wouldn't know how to enjoy a pleasure center if it leapt upon them. Not that it matters anymore. He had managed to break open the drinks cabinet and return to his chair, where a tumbler and a half-empty bottle of Solturian scotch were waiting to soothe him. Ah, well, after a few of these, perhaps I shan't feel the bullets when they strike. Or the dagger as it slits me. Oh, there must be something we can do instead of sitting here doing nothing. The doctor looked up from a mass of charts and papers he had purloined from Pierpoint's safe. You're the only one who's sitting there doing nothing, he pointed out. Stokes groaned. Today I have been attacked, robbed, jailed, gassed, and forced to run up miles of stairs. I hardly call that doing nothing. Not to mention being chased by those Neanderthal beasts. That's hardly a fair comparison, the doctor said without looking up from his work. The Neanderthals were charming people, much better mannered than their successors, and they could knock up a superb mammoth casserole. Doctor, called Romana from the porthole. I'm worried. You're worried? Oh, that hardly makes me feel much better, grumbled Stokes. He felt like crying. Shut up, the doctor told him. What vexes you, Romana? That planet. I've calculated our new trajectory, and it looks like we've entered a decaying orbit. We're going much faster than we should be. The doctor hurried over and looked out. There's really no need to check, Romana said frostily. Goodness, said the doctor. Romana, I think you're right. I know I'm right. He leapt back to the desk, cleared a space among the papers, and beckoned her over. Right, I think it's time for our little conference. I suppose you're going to ignore me, whined Stokes, pouring another drink. I shall just sit here and quietly go insane, shall I? I shouldn't think you've ever done anything quietly, said Romana. Now, Pierpoint is a very powerful man, the doctor began, with access to all sorts of information. As High Archon, he has contacts in administrative bureau throughout the government and military of the Uva Beta Uva system. And as we know, he's crooked, a rotten apple, a bad egg. Romana was looking over the papers. He's been trading in that information for his own benefit. He owns huge stakes in these companies, all of which have been granted excessive public funds. Oh, a great discovery, Stokes snorted. It's called corruption, dear. Everybody's at it. The doctor went on. I imagine that's how he started out. But as he got more confident, his ideas got bigger. Take a look at this. He passed Romana a sheaf of printout he had taken from the safe. She ran widening eyes quickly down the list of figures. He's running about a quarter of the major crime syndicates on Planet 5. He supplies the information, they do his dirty work. He takes 30%. Pardon my interruption, said Stokes, but High Archon Pierpoint is hardly the sort of person that the average gangster is going to conduct business with. There's no need to carry out direct business, said the doctor. "He probably uses codes and signals to establish the link. And if he needs his partners out of the way for some reason, well, they'll never know enough to implicate him. It's a very tidy little racket."
"But why involve himself with a fanatic like Zeus?" Romana asked.
The doctor considered this objection. "Well, most fanatics never get past their front gates. Zeus has the advantage of being very, very clever. Anyway, somehow they joined up." He picked up the list of Pierpoint's commercial interests. "Now, as one of the directors of the Board of Mineralogical Extraction, Pierpoint received news about new finds before almost everybody else." He passed her a slim blue folder. "This report was compiled for Pierpoint about 5 years ago. He hired a mineralogist to carry out an independent survey of Planet 11. Nobody had ever done that before because it's a very inhospitable place. It can't be surveyed from orbit or by remote sensors either. Far too much atmospheric distortion." "We hardly need a reminding of that," Stokes said with a nervous glance at the porthole. "Is all this chat really necessary? We're about to crash." "I'm determined to get to the bottom of this plot before we go any further," the doctor told him severely. "Now then, Pierpoint must have related the findings of the survey, incidentally, to Zeus, and she noted that the property is rich in helicon. 1.3% of planetary mass, in fact."
"And she can use helicon to reincarnate herself," mused Romana. "But how is that possible?"
The doctor shrugged. "It has to be something to do with that energy from her eyes. It reacts to molten helicon, allowing her to record psychokinetic information along telepathic wavelengths. However it works, it copied her personality, her memories, even her physical attributes."
Romana tutted. "That's an irritatingly vague theory."
"Well, it's the best I can do at the moment," the doctor snapped. "You'll just have to accept it. So, Zeus and Pierpoint hatched a plot to mine the helicon for themselves. She needs him to keep prying eyes well away." "But the helicon is worthless to Pierpoint. He can't duplicate himself, surely?" asked Stokes. "It's possible that she could do it for him," said the doctor. "She promised him half the spoils from Planet 11. That's always been the deal. But then the police struck lucky for once and captured Zeus. It looked as if the game was up." He leaned forward. "Until you presented yourself, Mr. Stokes." The artist drew back. "Oh, really? I suppose the blame for all of this affair is now to be laid at my door?" The doctor nodded. "Yes. You gave them a legitimate reason to bring Zeus into contact, very briefly, with just enough liquid helicon to cross herself over. Her original self was executed, and her new half slowly took control of poor Margo through the mask. And that's when things started going wrong for old Pierpoint."
With help from his whiskey glass, Stokes had put his immediate discomfort aside for a moment and had become engrossed in all of this double-dealing and intrigue, which appealed to his macabre sensibilities. "I see. Because he didn't know that Zeus was chummy with the Nisbet brothers?" "Quite," said the doctor. "She'd planned to call them in from the beginning. She needed strong allies with mining equipment, and they fitted the bill. She's thrown them some wild story about Belzite reserves and arranged to send a homing signal when she was ready. As Margo lost control, Zeus got her to steal a transmitter from stores, ready to send the beam." "And what about the raid on the survey base?" asked Romana.
The doctor nodded grimly. "That came about because Zeus was dormant in Margo's thoughts. When Margo read that the McConaughey mining team were coming to the end of their survey, Zeus panicked. Although the place is technically worthless, there's a recession on, and there was a slim chance the company might have gone in before she could organize herself. She summoned up all of her power and took control for just one night. Margo transmatted herself to 11 and killed the survey team. And that put the markers on any plans McConaughey might have had for a while. Then Zeus came back up here and fiddled with the computers to cover her tracks, as we know."
"I see," said Romana, "although Pierpoint knew nothing about any of that. He was waiting here patiently for Zeus, as agreed."
"Hence his concern when Zai was killed," the doctor remarked. "He must have known full well who was responsible, but he framed poor Mr. Stokes.
Even then, he didn't realize quite how advanced his partner's plans had become. And the sudden Ogron attack was as much of a surprise to him as to all of us. Of course, he took the first chance he got to dispose of you two. That gas would have destroyed your bodies completely. He doesn't want any evidence around to implicate him, and he raised a finger and lowered it again. And, well, I suppose that's all, really. Got that? I can always go over it again for you. Stokes shook his head. They're a devious bunch, aren't they? I always preferred the hotheads. All this premeditation takes the passion out of the whole thing, really.
Well done, Doctor, said Romana. That was an awfully clever piece of deduction. He smiled.
Was it? Well, the time for deduction's over, Romana. This is the time for... He scratched his head. What is it the time for? Tea?
Said Stokes hopefully. Action? Romana suggested.
Yes, action. He made for the door of the office. Now, keep close behind me and do exactly as I say, and don't do anything stupid. Unless I tell you to.
Stokes got up from his chair.
Where are we going?
The doctor grinned.
Where do you think? Oh no, Stokes pleaded. Not the Nisbet brothers, please! The doctor stopped in the doorway. This asteroid is headed straight for that planet, and I'm the only person aboard who can stop it.
Romana coughed.
Well, perhaps not quite the only person. Anyway, let's be off. We've wasted enough time talking.
He strode away with Romana at his heels. Stokes considered his options. He could drink himself into oblivion, he supposed. Then again, he hated being alone. He picked up the bottle of whiskey and followed them. The asteroid roared just above the upper atmospheric belt of Planet 11. Heat insulation material on the buildings of the Justice Block flaked away as the friction caused by the decaying orbit increased and the pull of the small planet's gravity strengthened. Balls of orange fire shot from the rocket ports as the asteroid tumbled towards what seemed certain destruction. The doctor pressed his ear to the door of computer control. "There's no alternative," he heard Zaius say. "We must return to your ship and evacuate." One of the brothers replied, "Our ship would never reach escape velocity from this far down. We're finished."
"Not necessarily."
The doctor threw the doors open and bounded in, followed by Romana and Stokes, whose normally sallow complexion had begun to turn a disquieting shade of green from a combination of drink, fear, exhaustion, and space sickness. The doctor rattled on before anybody had the chance to shoot him, a tactic that usually worked.
"Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you again, Zaius, and you, Mr. Pierpoint, and you charming Ogron gentlemen, and you must be the Nisbet brothers. You don't know me. I'm the doctor. This is my friend Romana, and that's Mr. Stokes, and you do know, unless you listen to me, I think we're all going to die."
Zaius sprang from her position at the navigation control, resentment boiling in her eyes. "Your robot was responsible for this, Doctor."
"What, K9? The doctor tutted. "I sometimes wonder why I ever let him off his lead. Now then." He indicated the navigation console. "That looks important. I think I'd like to take a little look, if I may."
Romana followed him. "It looks like their control linkage is blown. Were they using a reverse thrust reaction?"
"Constant blast from the excitation suppression, more like."
"What, in a static charged field with torpor balance?"
"Looks like it." The doctor entered a series of commands into the computer. "This is going to take some working out. These engines weren't built for this sort of thing, after all." "Neither was I," called Stokes. He had found himself next to Pierpoint and the Ogrons. "Your scheme looks ended, at any rate."
Pierpoint regarded him with contempt.
"You are supposed to be dead."
Stokes shrugged and pointed a finger.
"And you are supposed to be a trusted bastion of the establishment. Oh, I wish I'd never come aboard this dismal chunk of rubble."
The Nisbet brothers had been sufficiently taken aback by the doctor's spectacular entrance not to react with their usual threats of violence. He heard Charlie ask Zaius, "What's going on here?"
I thought he was an investigator. What's he doing helping us out? I don't like this, said Eddie. There's something wrong.
He's trying to save his own life, said Zeus. But there is nothing you can do, Doctor.
Well, perhaps you've been approaching this problem from the wrong angle,
he called back over the steadily increasing roar of the engines.
You may well be a mathematical genius, Zeus, but sometimes what's needed in these situations is some good old-fashioned creativity.
Romana prized open a hatch on the side of the console. What he means is that we're going to alter course by confusing the engines. If we can suppress the next blast in the chain for a couple of seconds longer than usual, we'll overshoot the planet by several hundred miles.
I don't understand her, said Charlie. Is she right?
Zeus nodded.
They could blow us to pieces if the blast is kept down for too long, but it's our only hope.
The asteroid tore open a dense belt of floating methane as it got closer and closer to the planet. A chain of brilliant blue explosions ripped away chunks of rock. A red haze began to form around the edges of the shaking rock as it dived downward. A blue acceptance light flashed on the navigation display.
I've sent the command,
Romana heard the doctor shout jubilantly. He moved to complete the operation but was pushed back in his seat by the crushing G-force. Romana had been thrown to the floor by the impact, but was now nearest to the open inspection shield.
You'll have to release the zonal flow valve, he called urgently.
She dragged herself up, passing Stokes, who appeared to have passed out. Zeus had fallen on top of Pierpoint. Nearby, the Ogrons were wailing with fear. The brothers had somehow managed to lose their balance with dignity and were seated smugly at control positions like successful players in the final round of musical chairs. Romana pushed herself on. She flung out an arm and stretched for the valve control. It was mere inches from her grasp.
Give it some welly, Romana, she heard the doctor cry.
Redoubling her efforts, she flung herself against the force, pulling her away. Her fingers brushed the enameled surface of the button. The claws of gravity loosened their clutch at the offered morsel. Incredibly, destruction was averted. The massive weight of the rock lifted itself free and roared off, its confused engines howling in protest all the while. The doctor shook himself and brushed specks of dust from his coat. He put a hand to his head and frowned. Had he forgotten something? Doctor, Romana groaned from the floor. He smiled down at her.
Do you know, you really should take a more vertical attitude to life.
Doctor, the capacitor limiter. He viewed the offending control.
Yes, what about it?
Almost before he had finished speaking, he had leapt forward and flicked it to the on position.
Well, yes, of course, the capacitor limiter. You didn't really think I'd forgotten, did you?
She pulled herself up painfully and drew a deep breath. Of course not. Apparently satisfied, the doctor swiveled his chair to face his adversaries, who were climbing to their feet, and clapped his hands together.
Well, there we are. We're safe. How about that?
He found himself facing the tip of a compact black revolver.
Get up and keep your hands where I can see them,
Charlie ordered. He passed the gun to his brother.
Cover them.
Romana and the doctor stood up.
Your manners are appalling, the doctor told their captors. We've just saved your lives.
Zeus was checking over the navigation console. She was joined by Charlie, who asked,
Well, what's the score?
We're coming out of orbit, but our course is still fixed, she told him.
A graphic curve on the screen picked out a path that would take the rock away from 11 and into interplanetary space.
In about 20 minutes, we'll be out of transmat range. We have to move fast.
Charlie nodded.
Right,
he mumbled. He turned to his brother.
Ed, you and Flark, take the prisoners with you. Get down to the transmat and set up the beam. Chivvy the lads along with the mining gear. We'll be down in a couple of minutes. Understood?
Understood. Eddie gestured to the doctor, Romana, and Pierpoint with his gun.
Right, you heard. Get into single file. No tricks.
Nobody's even said thank you, the doctor grumbled. Romana pointed to Stokes, who lay slumped in the corner of the room. What about him? He's no use, said Eddie. Get on. Romana found this instruction impossible to comply with. She knelt and slapped the cheeks of the unconscious artist. His eyes opened and he sighed. Not again. We've got to leave, Romana said as she pulled him up. Move, Eddie barked. The sight of the black-suited, broken-nosed Nisbet brother and the Ogron at his side caused Stokes to emit a mouse-like squeak. He swayed, but Romana caught him, and they were ushered out after the doctor and Pierpoint.
You intend to keep the doctor and his colleagues alive?
Zaius suspected the motives of her partner.
For a while,
Charlie cracked his knuckles.
Our mum always used to say, never chuck out anything that might come in handy one day. I reckon this doctor bloke might be very useful on the scientific side. He got us out of that orbit, didn't he? And that was something even you couldn't do, my dear.
Zaius was anxious to turn the conversation away from the exact details of the scheme.
The other normals, Stokes and the girl, they are of no consequence and must die.
Charlie reached for the public address system.
Something else Mum used to say. Sometimes you can untie a man's tongue quicker by torturing his mates than by having a go at the man himself.
An admirable homily. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman.
A look of fervor crossed Charlie's face.
Oh, she was. Ran the firm for 32 years. Of course, Dad got all the credit. She'd still be alive today if we hadn't been grassed on. It broke her heart.
Zaius laid a hand on his arm.
Do not worry. You will soon have your vengeance.
Spigot, who had been knocked down by the gravity storm, was nudged awake by K9. The policeman shook his long, permed locks. Hey, what was that? I thought we were going to crash for sure. He held up a hand and moved it up and down, an elementary safety test he'd learnt at school. We've leveled out,
Affirmative,
said K9.
The asteroid is now moving away from Planet 11. Probability is that the Dr. Master realigned the engines.
Spigot punched the air with glee. Well done, Doctor. So the game's on again. He patted K9 on the head. It feels good to be alive, K9, eh?
Empirical approach states that expression of joy in human condition is reliant on variable factors, social formation, physical gratification, etc.
K9 told him.
In addition, concepts of awareness also variable and semantically complex. Request specification of your query.
The request was to go unheeded. A chime sounded, and the voice of Charlie Nisbet boomed from the station's public address systems.
Attention, attention. Calling all Ogrons. I order you to go back to the ship. Go back to the ship right away and await further orders.
Could be they're cutting their losses and pulling out, Spigot said.
Unlikely,
said K9.
We must investigate and assist the Dr. Master.
Gajork and the two Ogrons on duty at the transmat had loaded the heavy boxes of mining equipment onto the platform and were waiting anxiously for their next orders. Eddie stood guard over his captives before the control panel. The doctor glanced at the settings. Those coordinates might have slipped, you know, he said. What do you think, Romana? The slightest variation in the beam and our molecules could be dispersed, she said casually. Perhaps we'd better take a look. She stretched out an inquiring hand. Eddie gestured her away. Step back, lady, he drawled. Everything's set up right, don't you fret. Well, it was worth a try, the doctor whispered. Better luck next time. Eddie chuckled. There isn't going to be a next time, Doctor. You're into your last few hours, believe me. We're only keeping you alive now, 'cause we might want some fun later. His lower lip curled at the prospect. Stokes screwed his eyes up tight and made short, sharp, gasping noises. Romana and the doctor remained unperturbed. The doctor turned to Pierpoint, who stood as tall and grey-faced as ever. For a man I'd say has a lot to worry about, you seem remarkably silent. The game's up, you know. We've seen the safe. Very careless leaving all that stuff lying about. Pierpoint said simply,
I do not want to talk to you.
The doors of the chamber slid open and Charlie and Zaius walked in with Flark.
Right,
Charlie said as he sent Flark to watch the prisoners.
Eddie, send the gear down.
Eddie threw a bank of switches and the Ogrons and the boxes on the platform shimmered and vanished with a pulsing electronic sound. A few moments later, a call note came from Charlie's inside pocket. He reached in and pulled out a mobile communicator.
Yes?
Good talk. Calling from planet, Mr. Charles.
An Ogron voice said through heavy static.
Down and safe. There is good air and gravity is on.
Right. Well done, Gajork. Stand by.
Charlie put the communicator away and turned to Flark.
Right, lad. Go back to the ship and follow us down to the base. There's a landing pad. Just follow the energy trace of the transmat.
Flark nodded eagerly, keen to make up for his earlier error.
Yes, Mr. Charles. We will follow. I will not let you down again, sir. I hate you.
Good. Now make sure you put down the right way round. Airlock to airlock. Right?
Yes,
said Flark.
I will not make that mistake again, sir. It is bad to land with airlock facing wrong way.
He saluted and stomped off. Zaius stepped onto the transmat platform.
We must leave now,
she said urgently.
There is little time before we come out of range.
Ed, set the timer,
Charlie ordered. He herded Pierpoint and the other prisoners up onto the platform. A countdown of 15 seconds flashed up on the console. Eddie patted his pockets and joined the others. There was an uncomfortable silence. Even Stokes was quiet, his head bowed. Romana supported his shaking frame. Zaius stood alert, hands on hips. The Nisbets stood together, faces set into the familiar, brutal impassivity. Pierpoint remained aloof.
Well, the doctor said happily, this is nice, isn't it?
Nobody answered him. The timer clicked down to 0, the transmat platform glowed with power, and they shimmered and faded away.